All right, well, I want to thank everyone for being here today. My name is Jerry Carbo, and I am the president of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. The National Workplace Bullying Coalition is an all-volunteer grassroots organization, nonprofit organization that has the goal of assuring that all workers are treated with dignity and respect in the workplace, and even further, that all workers have the right to be treated with that dignity and respect in the workplace. And we do so through a number of different methods, through education, through concerted activity and collective bargaining, and through legislation. In essence, our organization adopts Lance Compa's three-legged stool for the assurance of workers' rights. And that three-legged stool says that to assure any level of workers' rights, you need to have a strong labor movement that's focused on those rights, both inside and outside of the workplace. You have to have strong legislation that is strongly enforced. And then you also have to have employers that are in essence doing the right thing. And so that's really what we work towards in this organization. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. So before we get started, though, I did want to introduce our Director of Legislative Advocacy, Deb Falzoi, who can also tell you a little bit about the legislative work we're doing.
Yeah, thanks for introducing me, Jerry. So we are introducing the Dignity at Work Act across the country. We have active bills in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and we're hopefully going to have a bill in Michigan soon. We have state teams being built across the country. So I work on the legislative side and the marketing and fundraising piece. And I also run what's called Dignity Together, which is online courses for people to learn how to navigate and heal from workplace abuse, as well as a course for managers. So thanks for being here, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Deb. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our outstanding moderators. We also have an outstanding panel for you today, but I want to turn it over to our two moderators, Dr. Steve Haase, who will lead the discussion today, and Dr. Misty Knight, who will help us to field some of your questions and make sure that we're answering any questions you might have. So with that, Steve.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm an advisory board member, and just a little background, I'm involved with the research team and collective bargaining team. My general interest is in union research and also rank and file activism. So I think a lot of that fits in with what the NWBC is doing. So again, welcome everyone. And we have some questions for our panelists following the introductions, which we're going to do next. So let's get started. So for each panelist, just please briefly introduce yourself, name and affiliation, and then why did you choose to study workplace bullying? So I'm going to just go around and call on each panelist according to the order on my screen. So Brianna, if you could start us out, that would be great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Brianna. I'm a junior at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm currently studying neurobiology and music performance, on track to hopefully become a physician, working on that right now. And I got interested in workplace bullying through an experience that I had, and then I started working on research throughout my career with Dr. Ramirez. And we've been working a lot with publishing different surveys and literature reviews around workplace bullying, specifically in nursing and academia.
Great, thank you, Brianna. Next, Dorothy.
Hi there, I'm Dorothy Suskin. I'm an assistant professor at Longwood University, which is in Virginia. I'm a narrative inquiry and ethnographic researcher, meaning I study people's stories and try to make sense of those stories. And I had a really life-changing event that made me want to dive into the research around workplace bullying. So over the last several years, I have collected the stories of people that have suffered workplace abuse. I think to date, I have 147 different stories across 31 states and 8 countries and 24 industries. And I'm part of our work, research team here, and I'm really delighted to be here.
Great, thank you, Dorothy. Next, Stacy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I am Stacey Ty Williams, and I am an associate professor at Iowa State University. And I also, like Dorothy, I look at narratives of workplace bullying. Specifically, I am a communication researcher, so I really look at the different communication dynamics, how do we respond? How do we sort of communicatively navigate these difficult work experiences? And so I am part of the research team here, and I'm delighted to be here. So that's it.
Thank you, Stacy. Next, Laura.
Hello, everybody, and again, welcome. It's nice to have everyone here. I'm Laura Zurich. I'm the nursing research scientist at Hartford Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. As a nurse, I've seen lots of workplace bullying, and so I've engaged as a nurse in research and work with this team. My work primarily involves intra and interpersonal aspects of bullying and their effects then on workplace dynamics, patient safety, and policy development. And it's been about a 15-year run of very interesting work. So welcome.
Thank you, Laura. Sherry.
Hi, my name is Dr. Sherry Ramirez. I'm a faculty member at Simmons University in Boston, and I work very closely with Brianna, who previously introduced herself. We've been working for the last few years, especially on looking at workplace bullying in nursing, as she mentioned, and also attitudes and experiences of college students, because that's one area we've noticed that there's been a lot of work on workplace bullying for adults, but not so much asking, for instance, college students who have already had a lot of workplace experience, more than people realize, and how we can sort of catch some of these trainings and behaviors early on and try to see what can be done to have better career trajectories and outcomes for people who enter workplaces. So we are really delighted to be here. I also serve as the director of our research team here at the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. So delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you, Sherry. And Rosette.
Hi, I'm Rosette Adera, and I serve and teach at Pillar College in New Jersey, where I am the chair of the Department of Business and Management, and also teach courses in human resource management, business ethics, and organizational behavior, what we used to call industrial psychology. And I teach both grad and undergrad students, international and domestic. Workplace bullying, the topic found me. I wasn't looking for it, but it found me due to some observations in some situation that I was in. And I'll talk about it a little bit later when I share a little bit of my work. But I've been with the National Workplace Bullying Coalition since 2014. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Rosette. Okay, I'm going to provide a definition of bullying, and this is the National Workplace Bullying Coalition definition, and it's based on model legislation. And following that, we'll have some questions that we will direct to our panelists. Workplace bullying shall be defined as the unwanted abuse of any source of power that has the effect of or intent to intimidate, control, or otherwise strip a target of his or her right to esteem, growth, dignity, voice, or other human right in the workplace. Workplace bullying may take the form of moral, psychological, or general harassment, incivility, abusive supervision, violence, mobbing, aggressions, and other types of objectionable behaviors. Further, these behaviors may take the form of interpersonal interactions or organizational practices or management actions. These behaviors may occur face-to-face or via cyberbullying. The behaviors may come from any level of the organization, supervision, coworkers, customers, and other third parties. The source of power shall not be considered as limited to formal organizational power or authority. Next, we have some questions that we will direct to our panelists. So again, first up is Brianna. Can you please elaborate on how workplace bullying is defined and described?
Definitely, thank you. So I'd like to just emphasize that workplace bullying can be both physical and emotional abuse. A lot of people initially think of bullying as being kind of like a schoolyard play of children on a playground, you know, not letting another play with a toy or pushing and things like that. But it can manifest in the workplace as well as both physical and emotional abuse. Because I've had a lot of experience looking at lateral violence or workplace bullying in nursing, I would just like to give a brief example of what it could look like. One thing that many people might not think of is somebody withholding information from a nurse so that they can't provide the best care for their patient, and kind of doing this on purpose, just you know, as a form of workplace bullying. So it can definitely manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. And then another good point to bring up is that workplace bullying can happen over a period of time. There's currently some surveys out there, including the NAQ, that look at workplace bullying as having to occur over a period of time. Some colleagues of mine and I as well are trying to currently develop a survey to look at maybe different periods of time that workplace bullying could occur in order for you to call it workplace bullying. So that's definitely also a factor of workplace bullying to take into account.
Thank you, Brianna. Since this is a webinar, we wanted to check to see if there were any questions that had come up at this point that we could sort of introduce, and there'll be more time for questions later as well. So we do have a question here. What is the responsibility of a company's HR department to address bullying? If someone wanted to take that question. Jerry?
Yeah, sure. I can start there. So, looking at it as a plaintiff's attorney in the United States, that responsibility is actually nil, right? Because there are no legal requirements or legal protections of workplace bullying in the United States. However, when we talk about things like ethical responsibilities, there's without a doubt an ethical responsibility for HR to address this. We know how they can address it. We have 30 plus years of jurisprudence of workplace harassment. We know what good policies look like. We know what bad policies look like. We know barriers to those policies. So there's definitely things that they can and should do. And the other thing that I would warn to HR departments is to understand that, there's a big overlap between workplace bullying and unlawful harassment, and it's plaintiff's attorneys' job to make sure or to try to fit forms of workplace bullying into those unlawful harassment forms. And when they're able to do that, of course, then the employers may be subjected to legal liability, to litigation, and other things. And of course, there's also the business case, right? Workplace bullying leads to absenteeism, turnover, sabotage, and so on that we'll talk about later. And so there's the business responsibility to address it as well. Unfortunately, what we see is that HR departments are more likely to make the problem worse than do anything to make it better.
Great. So we're going to continue with some of the questions to the panelists, and we will definitely have more time for some of the questions that I've seen coming in the chat. So thank you for participating in that way. So the next question is for Dorothy. What are examples of workplace bullying?
Thanks, Steve. That's a great question. So workplace bullying follows a very predictable cycle that can seem absolutely unbelievable unless you have lived through it. So I'm going to give you the quick case study of June. June is a 20-year veteran. She has common characteristics of Target. She's an innovator. She is an expert in her field. People seek her out for advice. She has a lovely, benevolent worldview, and she is not interested at all in office politics. So that's kind of stage one, like you kind of meet the target. And then stage two, I'll call the jealousy and battle plans. So at this point, June gets a new supervisor named Maud, and Maud is a little bit insecure, and she's very much like a top-down leader. She immediately sees June as competition. So Maud befriends June, trying to get June to kind of let her guard down and disclose information that perhaps she could use later against her. And during like lunches and walks, June mentions that she loves to write and that she's actually a really good writer. So stage three is that precipitating event. Now, this is not the cause of the bullying, but it's just one of the reasons it gets going. For this case, June introduces like a really fabulous, innovative idea that is going to help the company better serve their clients. A good thing. But Maud gets jealous. She doesn't like that the spotlight's being taken away from her. She feels that it's a threat to her power. So then we move into that fourth stage, which is the underground battle. And here Maud starts to do kind of gossip, but disguised as concern. So she's out to lunch with her colleagues and she'll be like, wow, June looks really tired, or June's cracking under the pressure, or this new great idea of June that could really like hurt our jobs or bring us under scrutiny. At this point, Maud also goes to HR and says, hey, I really like June, but I'm a little worried about her. She looks like things aren't going very well. I just want to keep an eye out for her. Maud might also go to Maud's boss just to cover her tracks and say, hey, June's doing fine, but I'm a little worried about her, just kind of planting that seed. And then a lot of times she'll go after June's confidence. Like she'll say, hey, June, I'm a little worried about your writing. Anything that you write, you got to send to me so I can check it before it goes out. Then we move into kind of that fifth stage, which is escalating attacks and mobbing. And here the vicious rumors really begin. Maud starts to spread rumors that June stole computer files, which is a pretty common thing people will say. June is left out of meetings. June is punished for not knowing information from meetings that she was left out of. June's projects are taken away. Maud interviews colleagues and starts saying, wow, we're having trouble with June. You might want to stay away from her unless you want to become part of the problem. Maud then asks HR to put June on a PIP, or performance improvement plan. And at this point, June is completely ostracized from all of her colleagues. So this final stage is kind of the final resignation and cover up. And here June's health is declining. She's having heart palpitations. She's suffering from migraines. She can't do her job because she has been ostracized, and the resources and files she needs to do her work are suddenly disappeared. Luckily, June has documented everything. June is a smart woman. June goes to HR, is ignored. June goes to Maud's boss, is ignored. June finally says, okay, I'm just out of options. I am going to resign. She goes and talks to HR about that. Again, shows all of her documentation. HR gets worried about a lawsuit, says, all right, we're gonna let you go. We're gonna give you a very small severance, not enough to really cover her expenses, but she's desperate because she's about to be out of a job. And in exchange for that severance, she's asked to sign an NDA, or a non-disclosure agreement, so that she cannot talk about what happened, and she is silenced. And then Maud just picks another target and the cycle begins again.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Dorothy.
Yeah.
So our next question is for Laura. What is the most challenging aspect of researching workplace bullying?
Well, from my perspective, those very points that Dorothy just described are the points that make study of workplace bullying so difficult. For one thing, there's little clarity about what constitutes shared perceptions. So people begin to believe what Maud just said in Dorothy's example. And so what's actually stripped June of her right to esteem, growth, dignity, and voice, if after all, she's not doing her job? These are the kinds of issues that get in the way, yielding little agreement on what to do about bullying. What one person might consider abuse is viewed by another as normal discourse, often reflecting personal views of rights and privileges, reflecting the views of the bully, him or herself, who kind of takes center stage in all of this. And those views probably also parrot the ways one has learned to communicate across a lifetime, and the way they've studied bullying. So we can see it as an organizational problem, a personal problem, an interpersonal problem. It's very difficult to come up with a consistent view. There is always recognition that bullies communicate through actions or comments that tend to impose shame and blame. And also recognition that bullies never, ever take personal responsibility for what happens as a result of their actions. They are skilled at flipping the script, at making those people they target believe that they personally are culpable for situations that the bully creates, sometimes even responsible for the well-being of the bully. And it's pretty clear that bullies leave those they victimize, and there are victims, I believe, despite the arguments in literature against that. Victims are those who are taken in by the bully's ethos, as opposed to targets who are just aimed at. Victims feel responsible for the things the bully has attributed to them. This notion of feeling stripped of personal rights is a very personal experience, often not shared by those beyond the immediate victim bully target dyad. So you'll hear things from bystanders like, oh, just get a thicker skin, or oh, she always says that, or she didn't really mean it, or she would never do that. She's such a good friend of mine. So all of this makes studying bullying very challenging, because finding a way forward that looks at shared views is hard to come across. So in the absence of agreement about abuse and even what to call it, finding a focus to ground the study of bullying has really challenged researchers for more than 30 years, and we have yet to come up with a good way to address it.
Thank you, Laura. I see some great questions coming into the chat. We have a few more questions for our panelists, and and then we'll get to some of those questions definitely. So keep those coming in. The next question is for Rosette. What are some of the consequences and/or outcomes of workplace bullying?
I apologize, I was still muted.
That's okay.
One of the observation that I made, the story that Dr. Suskin just shared is so familiar, and a lot of us were nodding because we've either seen that, heard that, or observed it in our work environments. And so that was my experience as well, just observing that kind of behavior in the environment that I was in, as I mentioned earlier. And so I realized that workplace bullying was a whole different animal. It was observable behavior within the organization in terms of its impact on individuals and the climate and the work climate itself, with insidious effects on individuals and the climate, as I mentioned. And yet this workplace behavior was different from what I was familiar with in terms of what would be protected under Title VII. So what I did was I decided to look into the literature to see if there was any evidence of that kind of behavior, that if other researchers had observed that, then I was going to see it as well. And so I did a study and looked at literature between the years of 2003 and 2016 without limit of industry or geographic location. And I use some of the terms that we mentioned earlier. And workplace bullying manifests itself as abusive supervision, as incivility, as mobbing, as we have mentioned earlier, as workplace violence, as Brianna mentioned, as psychological terror as well. So I used a lot of those terms to search and see what the literature was telling me. And through some criteria, research, inclusion and exclusion criteria, I was able to whittle it down to about 32 studies. And of those 32 studies, I was able to find about 9 studies that mentioned abusive supervision with data of 2,306 individuals who felt that they had experienced mobbing or workplace bullying, or abusive supervision, and an environment of incivility. 9 studies mentioned a lack of psychological safety. And those 9 studies produced data of over 6,183 individuals who reported that kind of observation in terms of the impacts to themselves. 7 studies mentioned reduced productivity or an adverse effect on their productivity, with 2,411 individuals reporting that, and 7 studies definitely addressed the issue of organizational commitment. And Jerry alluded to a high level of turnover. And with that, there were about 552 individuals who reported their adverse impact on their individual commitment to the organization. So what happens to the individual? Many of them reported health and wellness impacts. Dr. Suskin mentioned the migraines and the stomach issues and the PTSD type of reduced wellness to themselves, to their person. Many of them reported a reduced perceived sense of justice within the organization. You report it, it's not addressed, you go to HR, it's not addressed, and you begin to feel that there is no justice within that organization. Perception of safety because of the violence. In some places, workplace bullying escalated to pushing, shoving, just a sense of lack of safety within the organization. Team conflict went up. Productivity went down, concentration, a lack of concentration on the job because of the fear, job satisfaction went down, increased errors because of the nervousness and the tenuous nature of every day. Every time you come to work, you don't know what's going to happen, so you begin to make more errors, which then gets you written up and sent to HR for performance issues. Increased conflict and violence, as I mentioned. Increased psychotropic drug use. Some people began to depend on substances just to get up in the morning to go to work. PTSD went up, an intention to leave, of course. The impacts on the climate itself trickle down. Systemic workplace bullying, where the bully actually is able to recruit other bullies around them. And I think there's a researcher who mentioned vicarious bullying. Negative reciprocity in terms of, tit for tat kind of behavior within the organization. Reduced employee commitment, as I mentioned before, reduced workplace performance and productivity, high turnover, and threats of litigation to the climate. So in my research, my conclusion was that workplace bullying is observable behavior with impacts to the environment. It creates a hostile work environment. And I realized that that is a convenient term, hostile work environment, because we already have law that mentions that. Some people call it toxic work environment or harmful work environment, and which threatens employee wellness, as I mentioned, a sense of justice, psychological safety, task performance, team cohesion, employee commitment, and organizational performance. And I can address some other questions as they come up as we go. Thank you for that opportunity, Dr. Haase.
Great, thank you, Rosette. There's so much there. It's just amazing, really. So much we still need to do, but great work. So we have one more panelist question for now, and then we'll take some questions from the chat, I think. So Stacy, what do you think is the most critical issue in workplace bullying today?
Oh, there's so many, but to me, this is something that we've been looking at now for decades, and we still don't have a lot of knowledge about what to really do about it, right? And that's the question that people always come to me with. So I'll publish an article or something of that nature, and people will reach out and say, hey, this is happening to me. What do I do about this? And the really frustrating thing is that, we have different strategies that we can tell, well, this could potentially work, this could work, this is, the research shows that, the best way to combat it is, through a group of people coming together and reporting it. And so unlike mobbing, where you have a group of bullies who coalesce around the main bully, in collective resistance, you have a group of employees who all say enough, right? And so for me, really, the critical issue is just really, what do we do about it? So determining these different kinds of interventions. And of course, a big part of that is legislation, which the coalition has been working on, and the development of strong policies. Because if we compare it to things like workplace bullying, or sexual harassment, until we actually had, some policy and teeth behind it, there wasn't really a whole lot people could do about it. And so now I think the same thing really needs to happen with workplace bullying. And certainly it's something that folks are working on. But I think for me as a researcher and just, I know have friends and family members who have experienced it, and it's just really hard not to be able to say, well, these are the things that you need to do. And, and so unfortunately we don't have that. In my research, people are being told things like, when you're here, I am your God and you will do what I say. And so when you hear these painful stories and the things that we do to each other, and it isn't that other people in the organization don't hear these things or don't witness it, but in my research, what I find is that the bully isn't often reprimanded, right? So in most cases, the target leaves the organization, either voluntarily, as in the example that Dorothy gave with June and others, or involuntarily through firing or something of that nature. And so, so when we have situations where these people are being treated this way, and they leave, it doesn't stop the bullying cycle, right? Because the bully will target somebody else. And so to me, we really need to come up with some legislation, some policies. Well, we have the legislation, pass some legislation, and get organizations to adopt and develop organizational policies to give employees a chance, right? To kind of combat these behaviors within organizations. And so I guess for me, again, the most critical issue in workplace bullying is really intervention and determining avenues that people can use to successfully address it.
Great, thank you, Stacy. Misty, do we have any questions in the chat? I know there are some, of course, but maybe one that you've picked that might touch on some things that we've talked about. We do have a sort of an overall question for the panel, but thought it might be nice to bring in some questions from the chat at this point.
Sure. And this is a really good time because something Stacy just said tied right into two of the questions that had been asked in the chat portion. Mary had asked about the responses of Human Resources Office to address. Were they responding adequately? And that combined with Suzanne's question about the liability of organizations when HR isn't appropriately dealing with reported cases of bullying. And so kind of looking at the combination of those, what is the responsibility of HR? How effective has HR been? And then what's the liability if HR isn't effective?
Jerry, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, I don't want to, go back to the same thing that I said earlier, which is, for the reality is that when we look at actual liability and legal responsibility, what we're really talking about is unlawful harassment that's based upon protected statuses: race, color, national origin, gender, age status over 40, disability, and religion. And if an HR department is involved in it, then what we would term that as would be supervisory harassment, or they could even be viewed as, in essence, in place of the employer, and that does heighten the responsibility. So if there is a tangible adverse job effect as a result of harassment that is based upon a protected status, well, an employer is per se liable. There's no defense to that. If a supervisor engages in harassment and it does not produce a tangible adverse job effect, then what we know is that the employer is liable, but they have a two-pronged defense. And that two-pronged defense is what we call the Farager defense. That defense says that, in essence, the employer has to have taken reasonable steps to address the workplace harassment, and that the target has to have been unreasonable in not following either that employer's policy, that internal policy, or taking other available remedial measures. Now, here's where we see the problem with US law is, one, that defense gets easier and easier for employers because of how circuit courts are defining it. Second thing is that unreasonableness standard of not following the employer's internal policy gets expanded almost every year. So what it's become is that you have to follow all of the steps of that internal policy that the employer has. And it doesn't matter, they've forgotten about the second part of that, right? Taking other measures, which could include going to the EEOC or going to the State Human Rights Commission. And so there's very little really that employers have to do today. Even when we talk about unlawful harassment, it's really been built up as almost an immunity for employers. And that's why we see such little success, so few successful cases dealing with even unlawful harassment. So when we move into general harassment that's not based upon a protected status, there's really very little. There's potential workers' comp, and that's only if you are in a jurisdiction that has psychological workers' comp, which means psychological activity that led to psychological harm. That's not the majority of states that cover that. There's intentional infliction of emotional distress. which I'm not sure I've ever actually seen a successful case for intentional infliction of emotional distress, because you have to show intent, you have to show intent to engage in extreme harm, and the behavior has to be what the courts say define as shocking the conscience, right? We all see bullying every day. We see it on shows. You know, we saw it on a really famous show that ended with "you're fired" every week, which was, to me, a terrible statement about our society. We see it on shows that deal with kitchen staff, you know, which I also think is a terrible indictment on our society to watch that and be entertained by it every week. So there really aren't a whole lot of things that we can say other than get involved. You know, get involved, take concerted activity, become an upstander rather than a bystander if you see it occur, get involved with our organization, help us to get unions to do the right thing, help us to get legislators to do the right thing, help us to get HR people to do the right thing, help us to get managers to do the right thing.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Sherry, did you want to add to that? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to add to what Jerry just said, in the sense that what we've been finding, I think one of the key takeaways from a lot of the research that folks in our group and others have been doing is how predictable, or, you know, how the pattern of workplace bullying really is. So even though it takes different forms, you know, case studies like the one Dorothy brought up earlier are really not that uncommon. And in fact, that's part of why we're so interested in this, because it's something that reproduces itself so readily. And like Jerry said, you even see it on TV, and people may not even realize that this basically shouldn't be done or shouldn't be allowed. So this is where we are right now, where there's this incredible harm that's being caused through these patterns of behavior that could be changed if we could identify them, and if we had good strategies that we could put into place, and if we could have organizations take this seriously and not only work it into their policies, but actually have legal instruments that would hold them accountable.
And
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dorothy.
No, you go, Laura.
Oh, thank you. See, we don't bully each other in this group. We're all very kind. I will be succinct. I think part of the problem is that, as we've seen so many times today, that there's a very emotional response to what bullies do. It's not thoughtful at all. It's really reactive. Sometimes it's self-protective. Sometimes it's intended to make things worse. But that is a major part of the issue, that there's not a whole lot of cognition going when bullying is considered. And it's very sad that we think films like Mean Girls is funny. In fact, that's how they advertised it. Hilariously funny. I don't think so. And Dorothy, I'll be quiet.
No, I would just say, building off of what Laura said, some of the stuff that has come up a lot in my research and other people's studies is that bullies are so charismatic and take great pains to do this underground. So before the target even knows what's happening, that bully has talked to HR, created a false narrative. That bully has talked to the bully superiors. So the target has this benevolent worldview, and it's like, oh, surely this is going to get better. Surely this wouldn't happen in my company. But when it gets so bad and she finally goes to HR, then they don't believe her because all these lies have been told. And that comes up again and again as a stumbling block.
Great. So just a quick follow-up, because, you know, we all do a lot of research to really understand the concept. And there was a question that kind of, I mean, it might be a little outside of our domain, but have any of you looked at any of the research on different treatments for bullying or effective strategies that, you know, I mean, I know there's a lot of research on post-traumatic stress disorder and treatments for that, but anything there that you've seen in terms of, like, once it's happened, how do you help the victim? Sherry?
Sorry.
Oh, I see a few hands up. So I saw Sherry's hand first, then Stacy, and then Laura, maybe.
You know, I was actually going to say, to preface that question, really, and from a public health point of view, which is what Brianna and I kind of take the perspective on for our work, is the prevention side. So how do you train people? How do you have policies in place? How do you give people the tools of resilience so that when they encounter these situations, they aren't just completely sidelined, right? Because I think that's one big problem, that until you've experienced this, you don't even realize that it happens or that it could happen to you or that it is already happening to you. So I think that's where a lot of our, not only, we've been talking a lot about the legal remedies because we want there to be accountability, but at the same time, we think that, same thing with sexual harassment and sexual abuse, that if you can prepare people with the tools to identify and be able to fight back, so to speak, that can actually be very powerful. So I think, in addition to the strategies for what you can do once bullying is already happening, I think we really need to look at the work on how do you prepare people to face it, to avoid it, to, maintain their own safety.
Great, excellent points. Stacy.
I completely agree with what Sherry said in terms of, what are some of these coping strategies, prevention strategies that we can use. There has been quite a bit of work done on coping and different ways that targets can cope with it, looking at support. So in some of my research, I looked at their stories and looked at how they talked about the different people involved in their experience. And so, something that I always tell people is, get support, get somebody to talk to and to listen to, because one of the things that people struggle with is that, am I crazy? Am I making this up? Because this situation of bullying, it doesn't make sense, right? We're, like Brianna said earlier, this is something that we think of happening on the playground. We don't think of it happening in the boardroom, right? And so, for me, it's really important to, find somebody to talk to, a trusted friend, a coworker, and then for people who experience it, or who have a friend or a family member who is experiencing it, I think it's really important that you just listen, right? And give people that space to talk about it, because it's just so crucial for people who are experiencing bullying, just to be able to process it. And so even how they tell their stories sometimes is jumbled up, because it's like, well, first this happened. Well, wait, no, because it just doesn't make any sense. And so really providing people that space to communicate about it and be heard and validated, I think is so crucial in helping as that first initial step in really helping people to cope. But yes, if ideally we can prevent it in the first place, that would be even better, like Sherry said.
Laura, you had your hand up earlier too.
Just probably adding to what both Sherry and Stacy have said, subtly coming into the literature, I'm starting to see two important points. First of all, for those people who have been targeted and victimized, to recognize how common bullying is, so they don't feel like, this doesn't happen to anybody but me, I must be the only idiot in the world. But everybody gets bullied all the time, so that sort of takes away some of the punch. And then for them to be able, as victims, to learn from what they've experienced, to go through talking and working with other people, and then to pay forward what they've learned, so that they're a little more empowered about the experience and become helpers to other people. Just starting to see it in the literature, I think it's really important, because the bullying is everywhere, and I doubt that we're ever going to get rid of it.
Yeah. Deb, I thought I'd go to you just in case there was anything you wanted to add into that or help us along here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you just said, Laura. I just want to add two things to that. For targets to realize, first of all, that they're not the problem here. And then once they realize that and they have somebody to listen to or to listen to them, and they process the emotions like Stacy talked about, to really understand what their own values are and how those are different from the person who bullied them. So to not really seek approval or hand over their power to somebody else, but to say, these are my values and these are how they're different from this other person's values. And those can kind of help people stand in their power more and heal. It's a long process, but those can be two big tools to get to those lessons learned that Laura mentioned.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Deb. Dorothy.
Yeah, I would build off what Deb said, that so often we think it's our fault, but usually the research shows that it is a larger organizational issue. And not even just one person, it is an organizational ethic that works within that contributed to the bullying. And then the other piece, which Deb has been masterful at, the targets and victims that I've interviewed, the thing that has helped the most has been advocating, because they usually lose their job, they don't get an apology. Many of their peers that they work with never talk to them again. And so there's this huge sense of loss and injustice. So to be able to get out and fight for legislation and speak up, even people that have signed an NDA and cannot tell their story, if they can still fight for the cause, it matters. Like that's been a reoccurring feedback for sure.
Great. Yes. Cherie.
Great, thank you. And that's part of the reason why we're all here. You know, we have our own stories and things that we've seen and things that we think need to be changed. So we really appreciate you all listening and trying to figure out how you can help this effort, because there's a lot of work to be done. And I think to wrap up this point, I think one last thing I think that's worth mentioning is whenever someone approaches me, which happens pretty much every time I give a talk about the kind of research that we do, someone comes to me afterwards and says, wow, I experienced this, or I saw someone who experienced this. And so what I like to do is I like to have the talk, which is basically, you know, this, you're not alone. This, you know, if you're in the situation, you have options. If you really have to, you can quit and it's okay. Your life will go on, it'll be fine. Basically having people realize that they have tools, because one of the things that happens in these bullying narratives is that the bully may sort of say, well, you're never gonna get a job again. I'm never gonna recommend you. I'm gonna destroy your career. You know, this is not uncommon. And so I think it's really important for the person experiencing this, or someone who you know who maybe experiences, is to make them realize that that's not actually true. There are other, you know, people in your life will go on. And we see this with really tragic stories where people end up committing suicide or other really horrible, irreversible consequences of bullying when you know, this narrative takes over and they don't realize that there are possibilities to move forward. So I think that's a really important point in terms of personal safety and making sure that, you know, these tragic cycles of loss can be prevented.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sherry. Those are some great examples in terms of, like, you know, how you've tried to help people through that, and, you know, what prompts them in terms of like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing, and hearing it, you know, at a conference or wherever. So that's excellent. Stacy.
I was just going to say, you know, there's that bullying campaign, It Gets Better, you know, which it definitely applies to workplace bullying too. But I mean, it's really important to remember that that trauma is still there. So advocating can help and so on and so forth. But even if you leave the organization, right, the scar remains. And so it's really important for people to continue to have those different spaces to kind of work through, because that next step, that next job can be really a scary thing for people. And, you know, am I getting myself back into the same nightmare that I was in before? And so that those reverberating issues can still remain. And so it gets better, and it can get better, but making sure that, you know, we're also recognizing and kind of validating that experience, that, you know, unfortunately we can't just leave that behind us at the organization. It carries with us into the future.
Great, thank you, Stacy. We do have a few more questions from the audience, but I just wanted to give the panelists another opportunity if there was anything else that you wanted to say in terms of how we can address workplace bullying. I know there's a lot of action that's been happening in terms of on the legislative front, but any other things that you would like to mention in terms of how we can address workplace bullying, or what would be some examples that you've seen in terms of addressing it? Brianna?
Yes, thank you. One thing that I wanted to jump off of Dr. Ramirez's point from earlier is there are things that we can do, you know, before it happens. And I think that's something that really has to be considered. Currently, some nursing schools are using social emotional learning. So you actually learn how to deal with the situation before you're in the workplace someday, or hopefully before you're in the workplace someday. And that can really give you a good perspective on if you actually are being harassed in the workplace or experiencing workplace bullying. And it can also give you a way to deal with it in a way that will hopefully, lead to a better outcome. So some nursing schools are doing this. Other nursing schools are also preparing their nursing students and giving them lectures on what is workplace bullying. I know Simmons does that. I just learned that the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences is also doing that. So it's definitely starting to come about, but it has to be done in more careers than definitely just nursing or just physicians or just one group of people.
Great. This, I guess I have sort of a follow-up that was from a question posed by the audience. And this has to do, it happens in academia a lot, especially in private educational institutions. Thinking about those situations where workers might not have the typical type of protection in these educational institutions. So the question was kind of directed towards Rosette. Anything you could, provide on things that happen in these types of institutions, private or religious educational settings, those kinds of things based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, certainly. Christian institutions can be experienced as patriarchal. They can be experienced perhaps as highly hierarchical, which then creates this environment that is conducive to supervisor abuse. And so, so that can be complex in terms of, how you even address that. That said, at the same time, within the same institutions, they have scripture and doctrine that talks about, loving mercy and doing justly and walking humbly with God. And so there is language that is antithetical to workplace bullying. Within the same organizations, they'll talk about servant leadership, for example. And so a servant leader cannot also be an abuser at work. A servant leader is very sensitive to the needs of those that he or she leads. And so in the same organization, you have these tensions, and sometimes those tensions, institutions can look at them and say, well, members of the organization, can look at them and say, well, this is what I'm experiencing, but this is what you're saying. But at the same time, that can be a pathway in terms of addressing workplace bullying or any other kind of harassment. I do have some colleagues who called in today, and we are working on this kind of research, looking at Christian colleges across the US, putting some language together in terms of, okay, does workplace bullying exist in those organizations? We want to assume that it does, but we want to ask that question. And when it does, what does it look like? And then we can look at some of the language that is used in terms of trying to address that. But thank you for that question. So yes, those tensions and those conflicts are there.
Yeah, and I think too, it's interesting, many of us in the work in public education, for example, and we have unions that are often highly, that hierarchy and the same sorts of things can happen. So I think it's a problem. It's probably, more pervasive in other sorts of settings. Cherie.
I just wanted to add one thing real quickly as a follow-up to Rosette, because I'm always looking for tools for people to use. And one of the things I've researched in the past is the Catholic social tradition. And the Catholic social tradition specifically says that all human beings have an inherent dignity that should not be violated and cannot be lost under any circumstances. And so I think if you're in the religious institution, especially in a Catholic institution, for instance, that's a tool that you should be willing to use. As my sons always like to say about Star Wars, that's canon, which I guess means it's sort of like this is part of the law, or this is exactly what it's supposed to be. My understanding for the Catholic Church is that's canon, and so use it.
Any other input from the panelists in terms of addressing workplace bullying that hasn't been brought up, or anything else that you would like to emphasize? We still have a few minutes left, I think. Dorothy?
Yeah, one thing that's come up in my research is organizations that truly have anonymous hotlines where they can report workplace abuse, because so many people are scared to go to HR, and for good reason, or they know that HR is not going to help them and they just don't know who to talk to because they're scared of the backlash. And so companies that have created some kind of anonymous way to report, but it has to truly be anonymous. Often it's not. It's portrayed like it is, but it's not. But if it's truly anonymous, that can be helpful as well.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Yes,
Stacy.
some organizations have ombudspersons that are situated outside of the organization, and those can be a wonderful resource as well, because in theory, the ombudspersons, their bread and butter is not tied to the organization, and so there's no risk in terms of them listening and really reporting back to the organization in terms of what the effects are. The other tool in my back pocket is, as HRM professor, my job is to produce future HR personnel that have a sense of what this is, and I infuse this kind of research in my instruction with HR. So the more of us that are involved in this kind of research, and the more we infuse it in our teaching, the better for future generations, hopefully, in terms of an ethics of care. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thinking about how we can move forward. Stacy.
I just wanted to say for people who are maybe wanting to know what they can do to help others, to elaborate on that a little bit. We often think, oh, this coworker is going through this, but I'm really too scared to jump in, or, you know, I'm afraid that maybe I'll put my job in jeopardy or myself in jeopardy. And in my research, I found that even really subtle behind the scenes support can be really helpful. So in one instance, the target had gotten just cussed out, chewed out in front of a lot of people. It was pretty horrendous. And later that day, they got a bouquet of flowers with no card. It wasn't signed because the person, I think, was afraid to attach their name to it, but they said it was really a source of comfort just to know that, okay, people are seeing this and they're supporting even in these more behind the scenes ways. So if you have a coworker who is experiencing it, Jerry used the term upstander, so getting involved, you know, more, so that's getting involved more actively, and that, which is always wonderful. But for a lot of reasons, people might be reticent to do that. And so so just know that any type of support is really helpful for people who are going through this. And when we think about bullying, it's not just a one-time thing, right? It's something that occurs over a period of time. And, you know, sometimes people that I've worked with, you know, they've endured it for years, right? And so so in those situations, that support of any kind that they can get really helps with coping and really helps them kind of withstand the mistreatment.
That's great. A great summary. I know we're getting kind of close to our ending time here. So Jerry has his hand up, and I didn't know if Deb wanted to add anything just to kind of conclude, but Jerry,
Yeah, just real quickly, three quick points. One, if you have a reporting policy to HR, you have to go through it. Speaking as an attorney, because if you don't, you might give up any potential legal right that you have. So do it, but understand it's not going to probably lead to a good outcome. So just do it to go through the motions. The second thing is document, because if you do have any out, you're going to have that documentation, but it also can be cathartic to do so. And then the third thing that I know has come up several times is you got to know when to get out, because, you know, even as attorneys, even looking at this from a legal standpoint, we don't want to be handling this for your estate. We want to be handling this for you. And if you don't get out in time, unfortunately, we might be handling it for your estate.
Thank you, Jerry. Deb, any final thoughts, or just to kind of wrap up, or if anybody else had any concluding remarks? It's been a great discussion. I appreciate the panelists and all the questions, the great questions that we got. And, you know, if we didn't get to all of them, we can maybe post some responses to those.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. The panelists were fantastic and the questions were great. I put a link in the chat about how people can get involved if they want to join any of the teams on the coalition. So thank you, everyone.
Sherry?
Sorry. I wanted to thank Steve for your great job moderating today, and also our folks behind the scenes helping field questions, including Misty and Kathy and others. So thank you all so much for your excellent questions, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Excellent. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon and enjoy the longer day, I guess, right?